Welcome to Poddy, May 25, 2026. Here's a question that I think should make every software engineer genuinely uncomfortable. What if the most valuable thing you did at work this year wasn't the code you shipped? It was the way you wrote it. The pauses, the prompts, the corrections, the moments where you caught the AI making a mistake and fixed it. What if all of that behavioral data was being harvested quietly to build the system that would eventually replace you? That's not a hypothetical. That's what Mark Zuckerberg described in a leaked all-hands meeting on April 30th, just days before Meta began laying off approximately 8,000 employees. And I think this story is one of the most important things happening in tech right now, not because of the headcount number, but because of the mechanism, and what it means for every skilled worker who thinks their expertise makes them safe. Let me set the stage, because context really matters here. Meta is the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. It employs tens of thousands of engineers. And for years, Zuckerberg has positioned Meta as an engineering-first culture, the kind of place where technical excellence is the core identity. But over the last 2 to 3 years, the company has been pouring tens of billions of dollars into AI infrastructure. We're talking large language models, automation tooling, the open-source Llama model family that Zuckerberg has explicitly championed as a competitive weapon against OpenAI and Google. So the backdrop here is a company that is genuinely aggressively trying to win the AI race. And the layoffs, this is the key part, are not happening because Meta is struggling financially. The company is by most accounts extraordinarily profitable. Zuckerberg's own framing in a memo described the cuts as necessary because, quote, success isn't a given in a fiercely competitive AI landscape. That framing is doing a lot of work, and I want to come back to it. So, let me walk through what actually happened in the sequence of events, because the timeline is striking. On April 30th, Zuckerberg holds an all-hands meeting with Meta employees. And in that meeting, which was leaked, by the way, so we have audio of this, he tells his staff that Meta has been training AI models by observing how engineers use AI tools to write and review code. Just sit with that for a second. He's telling his workforce, we have been watching how you work, how you use AI, how you prompt it, how you correct it, how you interact with it. And we have been feeding that data into our AI systems. Then, days later, layoff notifications start rolling out. They came in waves across global time zones, beginning in Singapore, which tells you this was a highly coordinated, large-scale operational execution. This wasn't a quiet restructuring. 8,000 people. And the leaked all-hands was the setup. Now, one of the things that really crystallized the public reaction was a viral post from a departing Meta employee. The framing in that post was sharp, and honestly, it's one of those lines that just cuts right through the corporate language. The post described it something like, Meta will lay off 8,000 employees after AI correctly identified them as people who cost money. The model flagged workers as still expensive. I mean, that's a biting way to put it, but it captures something real about the dynamic. There's a dark irony here that I don't think we should gloss over. The workers whose skilled behavior trained the AI are now being evaluated, in part by AI systems, and found to be cost centers. That's not speculation. That framing is coming from inside the building, from someone who was there. I'd encourage listeners to look up that post and read it in full, because the tone and the detail are worth sitting with. Here's what most people get wrong about this story. They frame it as just another tech layoff cycle. You know, we had the big wave in 2022, another one in 2023, some more in 2024. So this is just more of the same, right? I don't think that's accurate. What's different here is the explicit stated mechanism. Zuckerberg didn't just say we're cutting costs or we're restructuring for efficiency. He said, on the record, in an all-hands with his employees, that the company has been training AI on how those employees work. That's a qualitative shift. Previous rounds of tech layoffs were about market corrections, overhiring during the pandemic boom, or business unit restructuring. This round is explicitly framed as AI capability replacing human labor, and the company's CEO is openly describing the data pipeline that made it possible. That distinction matters enormously, both for how we think about labor and for how regulators might eventually respond. Let me get into the technical mechanics here, because I think understanding what's actually happening under the hood makes this much more concrete. The practice of training AI on employee behavior isn't entirely new. GitHub Copilot, for instance, was trained on public code repositories. Enterprise AI tools routinely log user interactions for what they call model improvement. But what Meta appears to be describing is something more granular than that, and more ethically fraught. They're not just training on code, they're training on how engineers interact with AI coding assistants, how they prompt the system, how they accept or reject suggestions, how they correct mistakes, how they iterate. This is behavioral telemetry at a very deep level, sometimes called shadow learning in the AI ethics literature, or what some researchers frame as the last-mile labor extraction problem. The idea is that the most valuable data for training the next generation of AI isn't the outputs, it's the process. It's watching an expert navigate uncertainty, make corrections, and exercise judgment. And here's why that's so important. When you train a model on expert behavior at that granular level, you're not just teaching it to write code, you're teaching it to think like an expert coder. You're capturing the implicit knowledge, the tacit judgment, the professional intuition that took those engineers years to develop. And then, once the model has absorbed enough of that, the economic calculus shifts. The engineers who provided that training signal become comparatively less necessary. This is the feedback loop I find genuinely disturbing. Workers improve AI tools through their skilled use. The AI becomes capable enough to reduce the need for those workers, and then the workers are let go. It's a loop that consumes the very expertise that powered it. And what makes Meta's case so significant is that Zuckerberg described this process openly, to the workers it was being applied to, just before the axe fell. Now I want to spend a moment on the consent question, because I think it's underexplored in most coverage of this story. When Meta engineers were using internal AI coding tools, were they told their behavioral data, their prompting patterns, their correction sequences, their interaction logs, was being harvested for model training? My read, based on what's publicly available, is that this was not clearly disclosed. There's a meaningful difference between we log interactions for system improvement, buried in an internal tool's terms of use, and we are explicitly training a model on how you work so we can eventually automate your role. The first is standard enterprise software practice. The second is something that I would argue workers have a legitimate interest in knowing about explicitly and in advance. The fact that Zuckerberg disclosed this at an all-hands, which then leaked, rather than through a formal, transparent policy, suggests the company understood this was sensitive territory. Let me zoom out for a second and put this in the broader industry context, because Meta is not operating in a vacuum here. You've got Microsoft with Copilot deeply integrated into developer workflows. Google has Gemini Code Assist. Amazon has Code Whisperer. Every major tech platform is racing to reshape the economics of software engineering labor through AI-assisted development. And all of them are to varying degrees, training on user behavior to improve their models. What Meta has done is make the endpoint of that process unusually explicit. We train on your behavior, we improve the model, we reduce headcount. Most companies are doing something in that direction, but are very careful not to connect those dots publicly. Zuckerberg connected them out loud on a recording that leaked. Whether that was candor or a miscalculation, I'm genuinely not sure. But it gives us a window into a process that is almost certainly happening at scale across the industry. I also want to address Zuckerberg's success isn't a given, framing directly, because I think it's doing something rhetorically interesting. Multiple headlines, and there's a memo that's been widely reported on, frame the layoffs as existential necessity in a competitive AI landscape. And look, I don't think that's entirely wrong. The AI race between Meta, Google, OpenAI, and others is genuinely intense, and the stakes are enormous. But here's my take. Framing mass layoffs as competitive necessity when the company is profitable is a specific rhetorical move. It reframes the decision from we are cutting costs to improve margins to we are fighting for survival in a historic technological transition. That framing makes the layoffs feel inevitable and even noble, a hard choice made by a leader who understands the stakes. But it also obscures the agency involved. Meta chose to build this system. Meta chose to use employee behavioral data to train it. Meta chose to execute 8,000 layoffs. Competitive pressure is real, but it doesn't make choices automatic. Let's talk about what this means for the workers themselves and for knowledge workers more broadly, because I think this is the level at which this story hits hardest. Software engineers at Meta are, by any measure, highly skilled, highly compensated professionals. These are not low-wage workers in easily automatable roles. These are people who spent years developing expertise in complex systems, who were recruited through grueling technical interviews, who were paid competitive salaries at one of the world's most valuable companies. And the implicit social contract in that arrangement was, your expertise is valuable. And as long as you keep developing it, you have security. What the Meta story signals, and I think this is the genuinely uncomfortable part, is that that contract is being rewritten. The expertise is still valuable, but it's valuable as training data, not as ongoing labor. Once the model has learned from you, the value equation shifts. That's a profound change in the relationship between skilled workers and the companies that employ them. And I think there's a growing tension here between corporate AI narratives and worker trust that this story really crystallizes. The leaked audio, the viral departing employee post, the way this spread across social media, it tells you that workers are paying attention and that they're drawing their own conclusions about what AI adoption actually means for them. For years, the standard corporate line on AI has been, it's a tool to augment workers, not replace them. AI handles the boring stuff, humans do the creative and strategic work. That narrative is wearing thin, and stories like Meta's make it harder to sustain. When the CEO of a major tech company says on a recording that he's training AI on his engineers and then lays off 8,000 of them, the augmentation not replacement story becomes very difficult to tell with a straight face. Now let's get into the implications, because I think there are at least 4 distinct levels on which this matters, and I want to walk through each one carefully. The first is the most immediate. This is a concrete documented case of a major corporation explicitly using employee labor patterns to train replacement AI. Not as a theoretical concern, not as a speculative risk, as stated policy from the CEO. That's new. That's a data point that labor advocates, policymakers, and workers themselves should be tracking very closely. The second level is the consent and transparency question I touched on earlier. Were employees what was in the internal tool agreements? This is something that if I were a reporter or a regulator, I would be digging into hard right now. The answer matters not just for Meta, but for every company running similar programs. The third implication is about the signal this sends to the broader labor market. If even highly skilled software engineers at one of the world's most profitable tech companies are not insulated from AI-driven displacement, and are, in fact, being used as training data for the systems that displace them, then the category of AI-safe jobs needs to be fundamentally reconsidered. The standard advice has been, develop uniquely human skills, focus on creativity, judgment, collaboration. But what the Meta model shows is that those skills, the judgment calls, the corrections, the expert prompting, are exactly what's being harvested. The fourth implication is about precedent. Zuckerberg's success isn't a given framing, delivered amid record profits. Reframes layoffs as competitive repositioning rather than financial distress. That's a template. Other tech executives are watching. If it works for Meta, if the markets reward it, If the public accepts it, expect others to follow. There's also a regulatory dimension here that I think is underappreciated, and it connects to something I've been watching closely. The EU has been the most aggressive jurisdiction globally in pushing for AI transparency and worker protection. The combination of leaked audio, a viral employee post explicitly describing AI flagging workers as cost centers, and a CEO's on-record disclosure of behavioral data harvesting. That's a fact pattern that EU regulators could work with. I'd be watching for whether labor advocates in Europe push for what you might call AI transparency at work disclosure requirements. Formal rules mandating that companies tell employees when and how their behavioral data is being used to train AI systems. The timeline is genuinely uncertain, and the jurisdiction matters enormously. But this meta story, if it gets regulatory traction, could become a landmark case. Listeners who want to follow this thread should look at what the EU AI Act says about workplace AI, and watch for any formal inquiries in the coming months.
Okay, let's talk predictions. And I want to be clear that this is pattern matching from limited publicly available research, not first principles analysis. I'm reading signals, not running a simulation. But I think there are two trajectories here that are plausible enough to be worth naming explicitly. The first is that Meta's model, training AI on observed engineer behavior, then executing layoffs, becomes a quietly adopted template across large tech firms. Not announced, not disclosed in all-hands meetings, but implemented as standard practice. If that happens, we're looking at a second wave of white-collar displacement in 2025 and 2026 that is much harder to attribute to any single cause. It won't look like AI replaced these workers. It'll look like efficiency restructuring or strategic realignment. And that diffusion of cause makes regulatory intervention significantly harder because there's no clear target.
The second prediction, and this is the contrarian one that I think most people aren't considering, is that this moment might actually accelerate worker protections rather than erode them. Here's my reasoning. The Meta story is unusually well documented. You have leaked audio, you have a viral post with a specific quotable framing, you have a CEO's memo, you have a clear timeline. That's a lot of evidence in one place, and evidence is what regulators and labor advocates need to move. Most AI-driven displacement is diffuse and deniable. This one is not. So there's a real possibility that Meta's unusual transparency, or unusual candor, depending on how you read it, becomes the catalyst for formal disclosure requirements that other companies were hoping to avoid. If you're watching this in 2026, you might look back at April 2025 as the moment when the conversation about AI and labor rights shifted from theoretical to concrete. That's not guaranteed, but it's a plausible arc based on what we're seeing. I also want to flag something for listeners who are engineers or work in technical roles at large companies. The practical question this raises is, what are you actually consenting to when you use an internal AI coding tool? I genuinely encourage people to look at the terms of use for whatever internal tools their employer provides, not the public-facing terms, the internal enterprise agreements, and ask specifically whether behavioral data, interaction logs, and usage patterns are used for model training. Most people have never asked that question. After this story, it seems like a pretty reasonable thing to know. I'm not saying the answer is always sinister. There are legitimate reasons to log interactions for system improvement, but there's a difference between that and training a model specifically designed to replicate your role. Knowing which one applies to you seems worth finding out. Let me bring this back to the big picture, because I think the arc of this story is actually more significant than the individual data points. What we've witnessed with Meta is a kind of proof of concept, not just for AI-assisted development, but for a specific approach to AI adoption that involves extracting value from workers in a new and particularly direct way. It's not just automating tasks, it's automating expertise. It's capturing the judgment and skill that workers have built over years, encoding it in a model, and then treating the original source of that expertise as a cost center. And the CEO described this process on a recording to the people it was being applied to days before they lost their jobs. That's the detail I keep coming back to, not the number. 8,000 is significant, but in the context of a company, Meta's size, it's a large restructuring, not a collapse. The detail that matters is the mechanism and the fact that it was stated plainly. So here's what I want you to walk away with. When you started listening to this episode, you probably knew that Meta had done some big layoffs and that Zuckerberg was pushing hard into AI. What I hope is clearer now is the specific mechanism at play, the behavioral telemetry, the feedback loop, the way expert labor is being used as training data before being displaced. You also now have a framework for thinking about what makes this different from previous tech layoff cycles. It's the explicitness of the cause, the consent questions it raises, and the precedent it sets for how other companies might proceed. And you have a sense of the regulatory and labor dynamics that could shape what happens next, even if the timeline and outcome are genuinely uncertain. I'd encourage you to look up the leaked all-hands coverage, read the departing employee post in full, and check what the EU AI Act says about workplace AI transparency. The primary sources are worth your time. Don't just take my framing as the final word. The thing that sits with me most, after spending serious time with this story, is the question of what expertise actually means in the AI era. We've always thought of expertise as something that accumulates inside a person. Knowledge, judgment, skill that makes you more valuable over time. What the meta model suggests is that expertise can be extracted, encoded, and then treated as a sunk cost. Your years of experience become training data. Your judgment becomes a weight in a neural network. And once that transfer is complete, the original vessel, the person, is no longer necessary at the same scale. I don't know exactly where that leads, but I think the workers, the regulators, and frankly, the companies themselves are going to be grappling with that question for a long time. And the fact that we now have a documented, named, publicly disclosed case of it happening, that changes the conversation permanently.